Hi everyone, it's Benitez here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's WTF episode, I'm going to share with you all how you can automatically refresh rollup fields for Dynamics 365 or Dataverse. So you're probably watching this WTF episode because you searched how to do this, and you'll see quite a few forum questions on how you can refresh rollup fields automatically. Now, most of the answers say to use a plugin or a custom workflow activity. However, both of these require code. So if you know code, then cool, you're pretty much good to go. However, you can do this as well with Cloud Flows, and this is what I'm going to share with you all today on how you can automatically refresh rollup fields with Cloud Flows. Stick around till the end because I'm going to share with you, is it really worth it to do it with Cloud Flows? Now, before we dive in how to refresh rollup fields with Cloud Flows, this is already blogged about by another person in New Zealand. His name is Boru Wang. Go check out his blog. I'm still going to cover it in this episode with some differences to his blog post. I'm going to share two different methods using Cloud Flows that you can follow. The way to refresh rollup fields outside of plugins and custom workflow activities is to call the web API functions. Now, this allows you to use the inbuilt HTTP connector in Cloud Flows to perform the request on a function called the CalculateRollupField. Quick break here to understand what is a function in Dynamics 365 and Dataverse. Basically, functions represent reusable operations you can perform using the web API. They retrieve data and return either a collection or a complex type. The function we're going to call is the one right here. It's the CalculateRollupField function. Now there's two parameters. The first one is target, which is the table the rollup field lives in. This value is the entity set name of the table. The second one is the field name, which is the logical name of the rollup field. Now, what this documentation doesn't tell you is that you also need to provide the GUID, which is the global unique identifier of the row in the target table, in order for the rollup field in that row to be refreshed. This is found in another documentation where it explains the syntax to use in your GET requests. This basically explains that because the CalculateRollupField function requires a reference to an existing row, you need to provide the GUID for that row in the table the rollup field lives in, hence the target parameter required. This is what the GET request will look like. There's the two parameters of target and field name, and the GUID reference to the row in the table. You have full flexibility on what labels you want to use for your parameters. I'm using entity set name for the target parameter and field name for the field name parameter. Keep it simple and self-explanatory. Putting this all together, this is what the actual request will look like. So let's break down this GET request for your learning. To keep it simple for this WTF episode, I created a rollup field for the account table that performs the count function to show the number of contacts related to the account through the account name lookup column. What we need to build our GET request to call the CalculateRollup function is the following. Number one, the organization URI, which is the Dataverse or Dynamics 365 environment organization URL. Number two, the entity set name of the table. You can find this by browsing to make.powerapps.com, view the table in your solution, navigate to Tools under Table Properties, and select API link to table definition. Then search for entity set name, and you'll find the value of your table's entity set name. Number three, the GUID of the table row for the rollup field to be refreshed in. This is pretty much the ID that you can find in the URL of the record that you're viewing in your model-driven app. Number four, the logical name of the rollup field. This can be found in the advanced properties of your column that represents the rollup field in make.powerapps.com. All right, now that we know how to form our GET request, and before I show you how to do this in Cloud Flows, I'll talk about the scenarios. Number one, create a contact where the account name lookup field is populated. Number two, create a contact where the account name lookup column is not populated. In other words, we're going to leave that field blank. Number 3, modify a contact by changing the account name lookup column from one account to another. Number 4, modify a contact by clearing the account name lookup column so that it is no longer related to an account. And finally, number 5, we're going to delete a contact so that it is no longer related to an account. Now let's head to the Power Automate Maker portal and I can show you how you can automatically refresh rollup fields by calling that CalculateRollupField function using the HTTP action. Okay, so this is my Cloudflow for method number 1. And method number 1 is when we are using a single Cloudflow. And the trigger that I am using is when a row is added, modified, or deleted. And the table that is going to be associated to this trigger is contact. So this is going to fire every time a contact is created. In the settings of my trigger, I also have specified a trigger condition. So in here, this trigger condition is basically saying, do not trigger unless the account name lookup column or field in the contact record contains data. In other words, if this is blank, then we don't want this Cloudflow to trigger. And whenever the change type is modified, so in other words, you are updating the account, I only want it to trigger on change of this field, which is that account name lookup column in my contact record. Okay, so the next action is using the environment variable of secret. So I will provide a link in my blog post to 2 videos that go through this in detail of how you can use this preview functionality of calling your Azure Key Vault secret value from the Azure portal using this particular action. And then our next action is the HTTP request action. So the method is get as per the Microsoft Learn documentation. And in terms of that URI request that we learned about earlier in this video, this is pretty much it here. And what you're seeing here is an environment variable that is calling my environment URL for my Dynamics 365 or Dataverse environment. I'm utilizing environment variables so that if I deploy the solution to another environment, then all I need to simply do is update this environment variable with that particular environment's Dataverse or Dynamics 365 URL so that this can be used in that particular environment. The next thing that you'll notice here is that I'm pulling the dynamic content value from my trigger. So this is going to be that GUID of the account name lookup value that will have an association to that particular account record where that rollup field needs to be refreshed by this Cloudflow. And then lastly, if we take a look at my authentication details, I'm doing it through Active Directory OAuth, and that's why I'm utilizing the environment variable of secret so that I'm calling my Azure Key Vault secret value in the Azure portal. And then likewise, I'm also using that same environment variable that is inserting the environment URL for my Dataverse. So yeah, this is method number 1. This is the Cloudflow. So let's head into my model-driven app. And before I create a new contact against this particular account, as of right now, the number of contacts is 2. So what I'm going to do next is create a brand new contact, and then I'll show you that this Cloudflow is triggered. Okay, so I've created the contact, and we'll head back to my flow in the Power Automate Maker portal, and we should see that this Cloudflow has been executed. So let me just keep refreshing, and we should see this work. There we go. And we can see that it has succeeded. So now if I go back into my account and I refresh my browser, we'll now see that the number of contacts has updated to 3. Awesome, there you go. So this has been updated to 3 and we can see that contact in there. All right, so scenario number 2 was to create a contact without an association to an account. Now this shouldn't trigger my Cloudflow because I am keeping this lookup field blank on the form. So now if I save and close, my contact is created. We head back to my Cloudflow. Let's refresh about 3 times. So I'll do it again for the 3rd time. And we can see that my Cloudflow has not triggered, which is the behavior that we've expected because of how I specified that in the trigger condition of my Cloudflow. Now, before we head on to scenarios 3, 4, and 5, I'm going to now turn off this Cloudflow. I'll close this one down, and that's because I want to talk about method number 2. So method number 2 is when we are utilizing both a parent and a child flow. So in order to use child flows, you do need to create it in a solution in order for your parent flow to call it. Now, the reason why I'm using a child flow, which I'll show you shortly, is so that every time you want to refresh a calculated rollup field in your Dynamics 365 or your Dataverse environment, you can call this child flow by multiple parent flows. So in other words, this becomes a reusable automation within your environment. So you build it once and you can reuse it as many times as you like by creating your parent flows associated to the table that has your rollup fields that need to be refreshed automatically. Now, shout out to George Dubinsky, who is another Microsoft MVP in our community. He's the one who actually suggested this idea to me that I follow through and share it with you all. And I agree. I think it's a really good idea because as people who create automated solutions, we want to ensure that we are making it easy on ourselves. And by using parent and child flows, well, you can reuse it by building it once. Okay, so the trigger that I'm using is manually trigger a flow. And in here, I have my parameters. So these are essentially inputs that you enter into your triggers. So I've got the entity set name, I've got the target ID, and I have the field name. So these parameters are going to be used in my HTTP request action. So let's go take a look at that next. And as you can see, I've inserted them as dynamic content values. And that way, every time your parent cloud flows call this child flow, it's passing that data from that parent flow to the child flow. And that's how this gets, and that's how this is reused many times throughout the automation within your environment. And lastly, I just have 2 actions that are sending a response back to the parent flow. Okay, so let's go check out my parent flow now. And my parent flow will have the exact same trigger as I showed you in my other cloud flow for method number 1, where it's when a row is added, modified, or deleted for the contact table. I have the exact same setup where the select column is that account name lookup column, and then I also have a trigger condition on this trigger. And then in my final action, this is where I'm calling that child flow and I'm passing those input parameters. So in here, I've specified that the entity set name will be accounts and that it's going to grab the account value from my field in the trigger. And then it's also going to supply the logical name of the calculated rollup field to my child flow. So what I'm going to do next is I will first turn these on. So I've turned on the parent flow, and now I'm going to turn on the child flow, and then we'll head back to my model-driven app. Okay, so now these 2 are on, and that other flow is off. Okay, so scenario number 3 was updating a contact where we're going to update or change the account name value for that contact so that we can trigger the cloud flow. Okay, so I'm in my contact record and I'm going to update this to a different account. Great. So then let's head back to my parent flow and double check that it has been executed so we can see that here. And then if we now go to my child flow, we can see that it has successfully executed. So going back to my model-driven app, and we'll go ahead and look at that account. So before we look into this account, this is what the number used to be. So now when I refresh, we should see that this number has correctly updated to 3, and we can now see the contact correctly under context of this account. However, what the limitation is in this scenario is that if we go back to the account that was previously associated to that account, that number has not refreshed. And that's because the Cloudflow doesn't know what the previous value was. It only knows what the currently updated value is for that contact. So I'll talk more about this later. Now let's talk about scenario number 4. So scenario number 4 is when we go and clear the field of the contact. So again, I'm going to open that same contact, and this time I'm going to clear this field, and then we're going to take a closer look at this behavior in terms of whether that refresh rollup field has been updated. So now if I go back into that account, we'll see that it's still showing number of contacts as 3, even though we cleared that account name lookup field from that contact. Now, the reason why, again, the refresh didn't trigger is because we have that trigger condition of it needs to have a value in order for the Cloudflow to trigger. And again, Cloudflow doesn't know what that previous value was. It only knows what the current value is. And because the value is blank, it's not going to trigger the Cloudflow. And so scenario number 5 is when we delete a contact. So I'm going to go back into my model-driven app, and we're going to delete a contact. So this contact is associated to this account. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it. So I delete it, and we're going to go back to the account, and then again, we'll take a closer look. And as you can see, this has not been updated. The refresh of the calculated rollup field has not been updated. So again, this is kind of out of date. And why does this occur? So what is the underlying limitation? And you're probably thinking, well, hey, what if you delete the trigger condition from the trigger? Will it trigger the Cloudflow? And the answer is yes. It will trigger the Cloudflow when you delete the contact because that's the change type of the trigger. However, it is going to fail. And that is because, like I said earlier, the Cloudflow doesn't know what that previous value is. It only knows what that current value is, which is blank. When we delete that contact, that lookup field essentially becomes blank because it no longer exists. So what are we supposed to do? What is the underlying limitation? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about next. So the underlying limitation with using Cloudflows to refresh rollup fields is that the functionality is missing in the Dataverse connector as of when this WTF episode was published. The missing jigsaw piece is the pre-image and context of the event. In other words, the Dataverse trigger doesn't know what the previous value was for the account when updating the account name lookup field for the contact or deleting the contact. The trigger response only knows of the current value it was updated to. The pre-image and context functionality exists in the traditional SDK of Dynamics 365 and Dataverse, but has not yet been exposed as a capability in the Dataverse connector. Now, for the million-dollar question, is it worth it? Is it worth using Cloudflows to automatically refresh your rollup fields? In my opinion, if you're going to use it for scenario number 1, which is whenever a contact is created in your Dynamics 365 or Dataverse environment, then sure, it's worth it. Go for it. But for scenarios number 3, 4, and 5, when you're doing some modifications to that contact or you're deleting the contact, then no, I don't think it's worth it until the pre-image and context is supported in the Dataverse connector. So in summary, the following are the scenarios that I went through with you all for method 1 and method 2, where only scenario number 1 was, in my opinion, an all-round success for refreshing the rollup field. Scenarios number 3, 4, and 5 were not yielding the behavior I would have liked since pre-image and context is not yet supported. However, when the product team does support it, then yes, this is going to be great. And you can use method number 2, where you only build it once, so that you can reuse that child cloud flow throughout your parent flows to ensure that your calculator rollup fields are always refreshed in real time. And that's it for today's WTF episode. I hope you learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!
Turn up. Let's go.